Good afternoon. I come to you this afternoon with a very simple proposition and invitation that we live generously. Now, when I say that, I don't mean charity in the typical sense of philanthropy. I mean to take a stand whereby we live from a place of abundance in our lives, and that we look upon our lives as an opportunity to connect with others, to solve the challenges of our day. Now, who am I? Why is it that I am standing here saying these things to you? Well, I'm like a lot of you. I am in my mid, almost late 50s. I am a father, a partner, recently a grandfather. I work as a mediator, as an educator, as a facilitator. I work with many different people in a variety of circumstances with my own foibles and imperfections. And from that vantage point, one of the things that I've come to feel is extremely important is that we need to re-examine the fundamental narrative of our society. The fundamental narrative tells us that we are individuals in competition with one another over scarce resources, and that only through this competition might we succeed somehow in elevating our society. This is reflected in our politics, this is reflected in our economics, this is reflected in many of our social institutions. And yet we also can draw upon very deep, rich cultural traditions that tell us that we're connected and that the fundamental relationships among us that can be fulfilled through a generous stance in our lives. This, then, is my dream. It is a provocative possibility that we might live generously and thus cultivate the collective capacity that is required to deal with the emergent complexities of our times. I feel essential that we cultivate this capacity because, as we've seen in so many issues facing us, such as the democracy movements of the Middle East and the Middle West, that we must connect with one another creatively and with authentic engagement to find new resources to address these challenges. I also feel strongly about this because at this point in my life, I feel that this is a point of service that I can offer. To go back to something that one of our other speakers has said, finding my grail, this is my service, something I have a capacity to offer. And thirdly, it's a way for me to be able to offer something that has been offered to me at different times in my life by people who have been generous with me and who have made my possibility to be here one that I can express to you. One of those stories is reflected in this trumpet, which I've had since I'm 13. And when I was 14, I was in one of those summer music camps that the public schools will sometimes provide. And a group of kids came with a teacher, Doug Bischoff, Mr. B they called him. And they were called Youth on the Move. And they sang about things that were incredibly positive, incredibly uplifting. This was 1968. This was not a positive, uplifting time in our lives. And I found in them a message that I resonated with, which got me out of circumstances in my own family that I needed to be free of. And he provided for 100+ kids similar opportunities, though even more so out of poverty, so that we could travel all over, not only Yonkers, New York, where we were, but all up and down New York and across to England and Ireland. And I was able to find a way to use my trumpeting as a form of expressing leadership. That freed me. I'm grateful to Mr. B for having been there. And I'm sure that if you reflect upon stories in your own lives, you can think about people who have been there for you in this way. And similarly, we pass this on. But as I'm suggesting, it's more than our individual actions. It is a collective commitment to developing attitudes that say that we are connected, that we must live from a place of abundance and possibility rather than scarcity, that we must nurture hope to overcome and transcend fear. We must catalyze our collective capacities to engage politically, socially, economically, environmentally in ways that connect us and allow us to solve the emergent complex issues that we're facing. And finally, we must be the board, to use a term from Zander and Zander's book, The Art of Possibility. We are not victims. We are not pawns, pieces to be moved. We are co-creators of the narrative of our lives and of our culture. This involves a reframing of our concept of self-interest. We tend to think of ourselves as individual sacks of skin, somehow walking about independent of one another, rather than as members of families, members of communities, members of what Seth Godin calls tribes. We are connected at all of these levels of self-interest, and the larger that connection, the more we can recognize resources in order to bring forward solutions. This is one cultural expression of this connectedness. This is a sculpture from East Africa that is called an ujamaa sculpture. Ujamaa is a Swahili word that we would translate to mean family. But in the context in which it is used, it is much more than that. It is the entire community in unity with one another, connected for their mutual interest. The ethicist Peter Singer likes to talk about the challenge that we might face if you have a group of picnickers by a lake. And this group of picnickers are having a fine day, and there are children that are swimming in the lake, and suddenly one of them is drowning. What is our ethical obligation, he asks. Well, an easy answer is, I have an obligation to save that child. Okay? But let's say there are 100 children that are dying, that are drowning. What is our ethical obligation? Is it for me to grab one child and hope that you grab another one? And hope that you grab another one? These are important issues. What is our ethical obligation? What is our connectedness? I suggest that we are all obliged to at least examine the possibilities of how we might collectively save as many of those children as possible. This is my daughter Maya with her grandma Sissy. A few years ago, Grandma came to Madison, live in assisted living. Maya was 14 at the time. A lot of 14-year-olds would view this as a great disruption. Maya lives from a place of generosity, and she embraced the opportunity to be of service to her grandmother and to connect with her and to deepen their relationship. And in turn, her grandmother has gained great satisfaction, immense pleasure, including last night at a show, that only comes through this relationship. These are the types of ways we might reframe our sense of who we are and how we live in this world. This is not an inconvenience. This is essential to how our family tries to live our lives. It's my son Jeremy, the love of my life, Lisa. It is an intergenerational aspect that we must look at this. We have all of these opportunities at this point in time, but we must create a world that our children and our grandchildren can inherit that is premised on a culture that says we are living from generosity. We must open ourselves to those possibilities within our individual lives. Meg Wheatley likes to say that all great change in the world started from a conversation that I had with some friends. You are my community. Many of you have been my friends and are my friends. We need to engage in these conversations, and that is why I've decided to devote so much of my time and energy now in this project. Living with abundance comes at many different scales, in many different opportunities. One place we might discover this is in the story of Flo Weekly. Flo Weekly, many years ago, was in New York City, far from her home in Hopewell, Pennsylvania, with her son who had just undergone cancer treatment. He had been released from the hospital, and they were now in the subway trying to navigate their way to where they needed to go. They were overwhelmed. She was noticed by a homeless man who came to her and offered his assistance, like any self-respecting New Yorker. And once he understood what her needs were, he made sure that she and her son got to places where she could get service. It was an act of generosity that she never forgot. She established My Brother's Keeper, which is an organization that quilts sleeping bags out of remnant pieces of fabric in small groups all over the country in 50 states, a couple hundred chapters. People take what is worthless and collectively make it into something of value. They don't solve the entire problem. They help people meet the basic requirements that they need in order to stay warm overnight and get connected to other assistance. Living from abundance also reminds me of a school district that was forever locked in impasse, and they could not resolve their collective bargaining agreements. And they had a new superintendent who not only introduced the idea of consensus bargaining, in which people really learned how to develop their own capacities to negotiate with one another, but he also did something else, small. He established an account in a local florist and said, if you notice somebody else who needs one, either because they're lacking or because they should be recognized for doing something right, buy them a rose. And so the Roses Project became a way that this school district was able to have lots of people being generous and connected with one another. Doesn't have to cost a lot, doesn't have to be complicated, but it changed the culture of that community. When we nurture hope, we take what is overwhelming and fearful and we reframe it. Instead of saying we are disempowered and we are afraid and we must resist in a way in which we push back with equal force, my invitation is to instead come upon it from a place of hope, come upon it from a place that says we can find a solution if we reflect, if we center ourselves, if we connect, and if we make a commitment to peace. When I was a teenager, the Hudson River was a river so polluted you could walk across it. And a number of people felt overwhelmed by that challenge, didn't know what to do. But one of the people that was engaged in thinking about this was the folk singer Pete Seeger. And Pete Seeger got together with a lot of other people and used his gift, his voice, his talent, to establish the sloop Clearwater. And they sailed up and down the Hudson, and they became a model for environmental education that we would now view as one that is replicated in a lot of ways. But in the 1960s and 70s, that was revolutionary. And coming together in that way and using song and using science in this way was a powerful way of bringing hope to communities about the Hudson that prior to that time did not exist. When we are connected with one another, we recognize that we have a capacity to deal with one another in relationships that we cannot otherwise perceive. Imagine for a moment that one of you steps up here and becomes a dancer, and you started to dance on this stage. The critical moment is not simply in observing that dancer. There is another critical moment when someone else steps up onto the stage and dances with the first dancer. Now, that first dancer has a number of responses that are possible here. She or he can either continue dancing saying, "Hi, pay attention to me," or defer, "Hi, I am now the one that you should observe," or perhaps for the two of them together to dance in relationship. We have the capacity to offer an invitation not only for those two to dance in relationship, but for all of us to join them in whatever dances we can dance. The capacity to do that, this catalyzing capacity, is available. Many of the people in this room know how to do this. We have facilitative capacity. We have technologies that have been expressed to us through social media and otherwise to be able to connect many different people. We must now bring that capacity to bear and nourish it around generosity. And if we then look at ourselves as not merely pawns on the board, but as the board and co-creators of the narrative, we are then empowered in a very different kind of way. We are then empowered to reconsider our economic system so that it is not simply about dollars and cents, but perhaps the three-legged stool of the green tier legislation that was implemented in Wisconsin a number of years ago, where we have economic, social, and environmental metrics by which to maintain success. Or we make a commitment to micro-lending or other kinds of approaches in which we're able to see multiplier effects for initial investments. We build new capacities by being the board. The Culture of Generosity Project, or the Generosity Project, has some first steps. One is this. Another is a website in which we are inviting people to share their stories, share their ideas, share their impressions of what is required for a generous world. And we are also trying to convene conversations about it. A lot of you may know I'm interested in baseball. And this is a ball that was given to me by a group of kids that I worked with for 7 years. When they began, they were a group of individuals swarming to the ball. After a couple of years, they realized that if they worked cooperatively, they could help each other out, they could find the way to feel, they could find the way to hit, they could find the way to be a team together. And this gift was a token of appreciation from them. It is a great appreciation for me to be able to speak with you today. I thank you for the opportunity and the ability to connect with you about this very important project. Thank you.